February 24, 1968, Havaka Bay, Kamchatka Peninsula. The winter fog hung heavy over the secret naval base of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, obscuring the jagged peaks of the volcanoes that guard the harbor. On the dark, freezing water, a submarine was preparing to slip away into the anonymity of the Pacific Ocean. It was the K-129, a Gulf II class diesel-electric submarine, painted in a tactical black that seemed to absorb the weak light of the pier. She was not the most advanced boat in the Soviet arsenal. She was noisy, cramped, and required to surface to charge her batteries. But she carried a payload that made the entire western coast of the United States tremble. Inside her vertical launch tubes were 3 R-21 ballistic missiles, each tipped with a 1-megaton nuclear warhead, enough firepower to erase Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles from the map in a matter of minutes. The crew of 98 men, mostly young conscripts and hardened officers, cast off the lines and steered the vessel toward the open sea. They were embarking on a standard combat patrol, a 70-day mission to lurk silently off the American coast, waiting for the order that everyone prayed would never come. As the K-129 submerged beneath the gray waves, vanishing from the surface world, she entered a realm of absolute secrecy. There were no satellites tracking her every move, no GPS beacons, just the calculated silence of the Cold War deep. For 2 weeks, the mission proceeded as planned. The submarine checked in with Fleet Command at scheduled intervals, sending short, encrypted bursts of data to confirm her position and status. But in early March, the radio fell silent. At first, the silence was dismissed as a technical glitch or atmospheric interference. Submarines often missed check-ins. But as the hours turned into days, and the days turned into a week, the silence grew heavy. It transformed from an anomaly into a catastrophe. The Soviet High Command in Moscow began to realize the unthinkable. They had lost a nuclear-armed submarine, and they had no idea where it was. By mid-March, the Pacific Ocean witnessed a spectacle of panic. The Soviet Navy launched one of the largest search and rescue operations in maritime history. Dozens of vessels, destroyers, tugs, subchasers, and aircraft swarmed out of Kamchatka. They combed the surface of the North Pacific, their sonar pinging desperately into the abyss, their searchlights sweeping the black water for oil slicks or debris. For weeks they gridded the ocean, moving with a frantic energy that betrayed their desperation. Watching this chaotic activity from a safe distance were the intelligence assets of the United States. To the American naval analysts at Pearl Harbor, the sudden surge of Soviet activity was a dead giveaway. They watched the Russian ships moving in tight circles, stopping and starting, listening and searching. It didn't take a genius to deduce what had happened. The Russians had lost a boat, but the analysts noticed something else, something crucial. The Soviet fleet was searching in the wrong place. They were looking hundreds of miles away from where the K-129 had actually gone down. The Soviets were blind, but the Americans had a secret weapon. During the 1960s, the U.S. Navy had quietly wired the ocean floor with a top-secret network of hydrophones known as SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System. These underwater listening posts were designed to track the propeller noise of Soviet submarines, but they were sensitive enough to hear the heartbeat of the ocean itself. When the intelligence officers went back and reviewed the acoustic tapes from early March, they found it. It wasn't a propeller. It was a singular, catastrophic event. The sensors had recorded a low-frequency impulse, an explosion, followed by the terrifying, crushing sound of a hull imploding under the immense pressure of the deep. By triangulating the data from multiple SOSUS stations, the Americans were able to pinpoint the location of the sound to a specific coordinate in the vast emptiness of the North Pacific, roughly 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. While the Soviet fleet eventually gave up, assuming the K-129 had been lost with all hands in some unknowable abyss, the U.S. Navy launched a mission of surgical precision. They didn't send a fleet. They sent a single, peculiar ship. The USS Halibut was a former nuclear cruise missile submarine that had been converted into a special operations spy vessel. She was a ghost ship, fitted with thrusters that allowed her to hover over the seabed and equipped with a heavy-duty winch capable of lowering a massive, remote-controlled camera sled nicknamed the Fish miles down into the dark. In the summer of 1968, under the cover of a maintenance cruise, the Halibut sailed to the coordinates provided by SOSUS. The search was a nightmare of engineering. The crew was hunting for a needle in a haystack that was 3 miles deep. For weeks, they towed the camera sled back and forth across the abyssal plain, battling snagged cables and technical failures, staring at grainy black and white monitors that showed nothing but endless mud and rock. The tension on board was suffocating. They were operating in Soviet waters, hunting a Soviet grave. Then the camera saw it. It emerged from the darkness like a hallucination. First, the sail of the submarine, lying on its side. Then, the shattered hull. The K-129 was resting at a depth of 16,500 feet over 3 miles down. The pressure at that depth is immense, enough to crush a human being into a pulp instantly. The wreckage was a tomb, but to the intelligence officers reviewing the photographs, it was the greatest treasure chest of the Cold War. The submarine appeared to be largely intact. The bow section was broken, but the missile tubes were there. The conning tower was there. And most importantly, the code room was likely preserved. The implications were staggering. If the United States could get inside that wreck, they wouldn't just find nuclear missiles to study. They would find the cryptographic machines and the codebooks used by the Soviet Navy. With those books, the NSA could break the Soviet naval codes and read their communications in real time. They would know the location of every Soviet ballistic missile submarine in the world. It would shift the balance of power decisively in favor of the West. But there was a problem. A problem so massive, it seemed insurmountable. The K-129 weighed nearly 2,000 tons. It was lying 3 miles deep, far deeper than any salvage operation had ever been attempted. The deepest rescue in history, at that point, had been a few hundred feet. This was 16,500 feet. At that depth, steel behaves differently. Cables stretch and snap under their own weight, and the darkness is absolute. To the Navy engineers, the idea of lifting the sub was science fiction. It was physically impossible. You couldn't just hook a cable to it and pull. The cable would break. You couldn't send divers. You couldn't use a submarine. The photos from the Halibut were sent to Washington, where they landed on the desk of the CIA. The intelligence agency looked at the prize and decided that impossible was just a matter of funding. They didn't care about the engineering limits. They cared about the codes. They decided they were going to steal the submarine. But they couldn't just go out and do it. A massive salvage operation in the middle of the Pacific would be spotted by Soviet spy trawlers and satellites instantly. If the Russians knew the Americans were trying to raise their tomb, it would be an act of war. The CIA needed a cover story. They needed a reason to be in the middle of nowhere, doing something that looked industrial and complex, something that would explain massive ships and heavy equipment without raising suspicion. They needed a lie so big, so expensive, and so audacious that the Kremlin would never believe the truth. And to tell a lie that big, they needed a showman. They needed someone eccentric, wealthy, and secretive. They needed Howard Hughes. 1970, Langley, Virginia, CIA headquarters. The challenge facing the Central Intelligence Agency was not just one of engineering. It was one of theatrical deception. They had located the ultimate prize of the Cold War lying 3 miles beneath the Pacific Ocean. But the physics of retrieving it were daunting enough to make seasoned naval architects weep. To lift 2,000 tons of waterlogged steel from a depth of 16,000 feet required a ship unlike anything that had ever been built. It would need a derrick taller than a skyscraper, engines powerful enough to hold a stationary position against ocean currents without an anchor, and a lifting mechanism that defied all conventional salvage wisdom. But the engineering was only half the battle. The true difficulty lay in the cover story. You cannot simply park a massive, strange-looking vessel in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for months at a time, surrounded by the Soviet Navy, without explaining what you are doing. If the Russians suspected for even a second that the Americans were trying to raise the K-129, they would swarm the site with destroyers. The operation would be over before it began. The CIA needed a lie that was big enough to hide the truth. They needed a reason for deep-sea exploration that was boring, industrial, and plausible. They found their answer in the geology of the ocean floor. Scattered across the abyssal plains of the Pacific are millions of potato-sized rocks, known as manganese nodules. These nodules contain valuable metals like nickel, copper, and cobalt. For years, scientists had theorized about mining them, but the cost had always been prohibitive. The agency decided to create a fake industry. They would pretend to be the first pioneers of deep-sea mining. They would claim to be building a revolutionary ship designed to suck these rocks off the sea floor. It was the perfect cover because it explained everything: the massive ship, the heavy lifting gear, the long duration at sea, and the intense secrecy. Of course, a mining company would be secretive. They were protecting their proprietary technology. But to sell a lie of this magnitude, the government couldn't be the face of the project. A government ship attracts spies. They needed a private investor, someone with deep pockets, a reputation for eccentricity, and a history of doing things that made no sense to the public. They needed a man whose involvement would stop people from asking questions, because the answer was simply, "That's just what he does." They turned to Howard Hughes. The reclusive billionaire, living in isolation in a penthouse in Las Vegas, was the perfect frontman. Hughes was already a legend of aviation and industry, known for his obsession with privacy and his limitless ambition. When the CIA approached his organization, the Hughes Tool Company, the deal was struck in the shadows. Hughes would lend his name to the project, giving it an air of legitimate, if eccentric, capitalism. In exchange, the government would give him the ultimate contract. The media ate it up. The story was simple. The crazy billionaire was going to dredge the ocean floor for treasure. It was exactly the kind of madcap venture Hughes would attempt. With the cover story in place, construction began on the Hughes Glomar Explorer, built at the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Co. In Chester, Pennsylvania. The Glomar Explorer was a beast. She was 618 feet long, with a beam of 116 feet. She looked like a cross between an oil drilling rig and a bulk carrier. Dominating her deck was a massive, towering derrick that rose hundreds of feet into the air, designed to lower the mining pipe that would supposedly suck up the rocks. But hidden deep inside the belly of the ship was the secret that made the entire heist possible. The engineers faced a critical problem. Even if they managed to lift the submarine from the bottom, they couldn't just haul it up to the surface. A Soviet submarine dangling from a crane in broad daylight would be spotted by satellites, passing aircraft, or Soviet trawlers instantly. They needed a way to bring the prize on board without anyone seeing it. Their solution was the moon pool. The center of the Glomar Explorer was hollow. It contained a massive internal hangar, open to the sea at the bottom, but closed off by two gargantuan steel doors that slid apart like the shutter of a camera. The plan was to lift the submarine from the seabed, pull it up through the water column, and then, while still underwater, open the doors, pull the sub inside the ship, and close the doors beneath it. Then they would pump the water out of the moon pool, leaving the submarine sitting dry inside the ship, hidden from the world, ready for the CIA agents to crack it open like a walnut. It was a magic trick performed on an industrial scale. The ship was essentially a floating dry dock with a trap door. To grab the submarine, the engineers at Lockheed Martin designed a capture vehicle that looked terrifyingly like a torture device. They called it the Clementine, but the crew simply called it the Claw. It was a massive steel framework equipped with large hydraulic pincers designed to wrap around the hull of the K-129. It weighed millions of pounds on its own. It was equipped with cameras, sonar, and powerful lights to guide the operators 3 miles above. The connection between the ship and the Claw was a pipe string. Section by section, 60-foot lengths of heavy steel pipe would be screwed together and lowered through the moon pool, pushing the Claw deeper and deeper into the abyss. At a length of 3 miles, the steel pipe would not be rigid. It would behave like a wet noodle, flexing and bending with the currents. The ship would have to hold its position on the surface with absolute precision, using a newly invented satellite positioning system to ensure that the Claw landed exactly on top of the wreck. If the ship drifted even a few hundred feet, the pipe could snap, sending the Claw plummeting to the bottom and destroying the mission. The construction of the Glomar Explorer was done in plain sight, but the true purpose was buried under layers of bureaucracy and deception. While the welders in Pennsylvania built the ship, the Claw was built inside a massive submersible barge called the HMB-1 in California. The cover story held that the barge was for transporting the mining equipment. In a clandestine operation under the cover of darkness, the barge was towed to a remote bay, submerged, and the Claw was secretly loaded into the moon pool of the Glomar Explorer from beneath the water. No one, not even the shipyard workers, ever saw the two pieces come together. By the summer of 1974, the ship was ready. The cost had ballooned to over $350 million billions in today's money. It was one of the most expensive intelligence operations in history. As the Glomar Explorer steamed out of Long Beach, California, heading west toward the dateline, she looked like a clumsy mining vessel embarking on a fool's errand for an eccentric billionaire. The press mocked it as Hughes' folly, but on board, the mood was tense. The crew, a mix of oil roughnecks who thought they were mining and CIA specialists who knew the truth, were sailing into the unknown. They were about to attempt the deepest salvage in history, right under the noses of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. They were grave robbers disguised as miners, and they were hunting for a tomb that contained nuclear warheads, dead sailors, and the secrets that could win the Cold War. The Claw was loaded, the trapdoor was shut, and the destination was a lonely coordinate in the middle of the North Pacific. July 4th, 1974, the North Pacific Ocean. The Hughes Glomar Explorer arrived at the site of the wreck on Independence Day, a date that was not lost on the CIA operatives hidden among the crew. They were stationed 1,560 miles northwest of Hawaii, floating over a patch of ocean so deep and desolate that it felt like another planet. The weather was mercifully calm, but the isolation was absolute. Beneath their keel, 3 miles down in the crushing blackness, lay the K-129. The operation began immediately. This was not a quick snatch and grab. It was a slow, agonizing descent. The crew began the process of tripping pipe, section by section. 60-foot lengths of heavy steel pipe were screwed together by the massive derrick and lowered through the open doors of the moon pool. At the end of this growing steel tendril hung the Claw, descending into the abyss at a glacial pace of a few feet per minute. It was a feat of engineering that required perfect synchronization. The ship's dynamic positioning system, a computer-controlled network of thrusters, that was decades ahead of its time, fought the ocean currents, keeping the massive vessel stationary within a radius of 40 feet. If they drifted too far, the pipe string would snap like a dry twig. For days, the pipe went down. 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 15,000 feet. The tension on the ship was palpable. The roughnecks on the rig floor thought they were mining for manganese nodules, but the CIA men in the control room, known as the Black Room, were glued to the sonar screens, watching the Claw approach the two. Then, just as the Claw was nearing the bottom, The radar on the bridge lit up. A ship was approaching. It wasn't a merchant vessel. It was a Soviet naval tug, the SB-10. It came barreling out of the mist, heading straight for the Glomar Explorer. The CIA mission director froze. Had they been compromised? Had the Kremlin figured out the lie? The Soviet tug slowed down and began to circle the massive American ship. On the bridge of the Glomar, the captain maintained radio silence, sticking to the cover story. They were just miners. They were just eccentric Americans looking for rocks. The Russian captain was suspicious. He hailed them on the radio, asking what they were doing. The Glomar replied with a bored, standard response, conducting oceanic mining research. The Russian tug moved closer, dangerously close. Crewmen on the Soviet ship stood on the deck with binoculars, taking photographs of the derrick, the pipe string, and the strange equipment cluttering the deck. For the CIA agents, it was a heart-stopping game of chicken. If the Russians saw anything that looked like salvage gear, a diving bell, a winch for a submarine, anything they would know, but the disguise held. The Glomar Explorer looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a messy industrial mining ship. The moon pool doors were underwater, hiding the secret. The pipe string disappeared into the ocean, indistinguishable from a drilling pipe. After 2 days of harassment, the SB-10 finally turned away and steamed north. The crew breathed a collective sigh of relief. The deception had worked, but the relief was short-lived. A week later, another blip appeared on the radar. This time, it was serious. It was the Soviet missile range instrumentation ship, Chazma. This wasn't a tug. It was a sophisticated spy ship, bristling with antennas and electronic surveillance gear, and it was accompanied by the SB-10, which had returned. The Russians were back, and they were aggressive. The Chazma pulled alongside the Glomar Explorer, blasting messages over a loudspeaker, demanding to know the nature of the operation. They maneuvered aggressively, cutting across the Glomar's bow, trying to force a reaction. At one point, a Soviet helicopter lifted off the deck of the Chazma and hovered just feet above the Glomar's derrick, the downdraft whipping the faces of the American crew. The pilot was trying to look down the pipe, trying to see what was happening in the moon pool. Inside the black room, the CIA agents prepared for the worst. They had orders to destroy the classified material if they were boarded. They had crates of sensitive documents stacked next to incinerators. They had blocked the landing pad with crates to prevent the helicopter from setting down. It was a standoff on the high seas, two superpowers staring each other down over a grave. But the Russians were handicapped by their own bureaucracy. They couldn't imagine that the Americans were crazy enough to try to lift a submarine from 3 miles down. It was physically impossible. The Soviet intelligence analysts had concluded that the Glomar Explorer was likely a cover for installing an underwater listening device, but certainly not a salvage ship. The audacity of the plan was its best defense. Eventually, the Soviet commander, unable to find proof of foul play and likely bored by the sight of men simply screwing pipes together, signaled a departure. The Chazma and the tug turned their bows toward home. The Glomar Explorer was alone again. But now they faced the real enemy, the physics of the deep. The claw was finally hovering just feet above the K-129. The operators in the control room watched the video feed from the dark abyss. The submarine lay broken and rusted in the silt. It was a somber sight, a steel coffin for 98 men. The operators maneuvered the claw with delicate joystick movements. The massive steel fingers opened. They lowered the rig until it straddled the submarine. The sensors confirmed contact. Engage. The hydraulic rams fired. The steel fingers of the claw dug into the seabed, wrapping around the hull of the Soviet sub. The grip was solid. They had caught the fish. Now came the hardest part, the lift. The winches on the Glomar Explorer began to turn. The pipe string groaned under the strain. The weight was astronomical, over 6 million pounds of steel, mud, and water. Slowly, agonizingly, the K-129 lifted off the bottom of the ocean. The mud cloud swirled in the abyss as the submarine began its long ascent toward the surface. For hours, the lift went smoothly. The sub rose through the water column 14,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet. The CIA agents began to celebrate. They had pulled off the impossible. They were about to steal the crown jewels of the Soviet Navy. But at 6,700 feet, disaster struck. It wasn't a Russian torpedo. It wasn't a storm. It was a flaw in the metal of the claw itself. A sudden shudder ran through the ship. The monitors in the control room flickered. The operators stared in horror as the image on the screen changed. 3 of the massive steel fingers on the claw had snapped. The structural failure was catastrophic. The K-129, unbalanced and unsupported, tilted violently. In slow motion, the submarine broke apart. The K-129 had been damaged in the original explosion, and the stress of the lift was too much. The larger section of the submarine, the aft section, containing the missiles and the code room, slipped free from the broken grasp of the claw. The crew watched in stunned silence as 2/3 of their prize tumbled back into the darkness, spiraling down toward the seabed, taking the nuclear missiles and the codebooks with it. Only the forward section, the bow, containing the torpedo tubes and the bodies of 6 sailors, remained caught in the claw. The mission was a failure. Or was it? The CIA director on board made a split-second decision. They still had a piece of the sub. It wasn't the whole thing, but it was something. They couldn't go back down. The claw was broken. They had to bring up what they had. The winches continued to turn. The shattered remains of the K-129's bow were pulled up the remaining mile, up through the moon pool doors, and into the belly of the ship. The doors were closed. The water was pumped out. The Glomar Explorer turned and steamed for Hawaii, leaving the rest of the submarine and its secrets at the bottom of the world. But what they found inside the piece they did recover would haunt them just as much as what they lost. August 1974. Inside the moon pool of the Hughes Glomar Explorer. The sound of the massive pumps dying down left a sudden, heavy silence in the cavernous interior of the ship. For the first time in 6 years, the forward section of the Soviet submarine K-129 was no longer surrounded by the crushing pressure of the deep Pacific or the freezing black water. It was sitting on heavy steel blocks inside a brightly lit industrial hangar, dripping seawater onto the deck of a spy ship. The air in the moon pool was thick with the smell of ozone, ancient mud, and the unmistakable metallic tang of decay. A team of men dressed in full hazmat suits, looking more like astronauts than sailors, approached the wreckage with Geiger counters clicking rhythmically in their hands. They were the first human beings to lay eyes on the lost boat since it had vanished in 1968, and what they saw was a mangled testament to the violence of the ocean. The disappointment among the intelligence officers watching from the gantry was palpable. A bitter pill to swallow after 6 years of planning and $350 million spent. They had wanted the code room with its cryptographic machines and the books that would unlock the Soviet Navy's communications. They had wanted the ballistic missiles that could level American cities. But the ocean had taken those prizes back. What lay before them was only the bow section of the submarine, a twisted mass of steel roughly 40 feet long. The claw had done its job, but the structural failure of the submarine's hull during the ascent meant that the most valuable intelligence was currently resting back on the seabed, 3 miles below, likely forever out of reach. However, the recovered section was not empty. As the technical teams began to pry apart the crushed compartments, they found 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes. These were a significant find, offering a rare glimpse into Soviet warhead design and propulsion technology, proof that even the tactical weapons of the USSR were designed for Armageddon. But as they cut deeper into the wreckage, moving through the twisted bulkheads of the torpedo room, they found something far more sensitive than weapons technology. They found the crew. Entombed within the steel were the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors. They had died instantly in the initial explosion or the subsequent implosion, preserved by the freezing temperatures and the lack of oxygen at extreme depth. The discovery shifted the mood of the operation instantly from an intelligence heist to a solemn recovery mission. The Cold War was a brutal chess game played by spies and politicians. But at sea, there is an ancient, unwritten law of respect between mariners. These were not just enemies. They were sailors who had died at their posts. The CIA director on board made the decision that they would not be treated as biological waste or intelligence artifacts. They would be treated with full military honors. On September 4th, 1974, a surreal ceremony took place on the deck of the Glomar Explorer, thousands of miles from land. The ship was stopped. The American crew lined up on the deck in their dress uniforms. A chaplain spoke a prayer for the dead. The bodies of the 6 Soviet sailors were placed in a metal container, draped not in the stars and stripes, but in the Soviet naval ensign of flag that the CIA had specially sewn on board for this specific purpose. As a camera rolled to document the event, the container was gently slid from under the flag and committed to the deep, returning the men to the ocean that had claimed them. The service ended with the playing of the Soviet national anthem, its somber notes drifting out over the empty Pacific. It was a moment of profound humanity in an inhuman conflict, a secret funeral for enemies who were honored as brothers. While the Glomar Explorer was steaming back to Hawaii, carrying its nuclear torpedoes and its secret film reels, the cover story that had protected the mission for so long was beginning to unravel, not because of Soviet spies, but because of a common street crime in Los Angeles. On the night of June 5, 1974, just weeks before the Glomar had arrived at the recovery site, a group of thieves had broken into a nondescript building at 7000 Romaine Street in Hollywood. This was the nerve center of Howard Hughes' vast business empire, a fortress of filing cabinets and safes. The burglars were looking for cash or blackmail material on Hughes, who was known to keep large sums of money hidden away. They used an oxyacetylene torch to burn open a safe in the office of Hughes' top aide. They didn't find millions in cash, but they found something far more dangerous. A handful of internal memos describing a secret contract between the Hughes Tool Company and the CIA for a project codenamed Jennifer. The thieves fled into the night with the documents, unaware that they were holding the biggest secret of the Cold War. It didn't take them long to realize the value of what they had stolen. They attempted to blackmail the Hughes organization, demanding $1 million in exchange for the return of the papers. The CIA panicked. If the documents were released, the cover story would be blown. The Russians would know the Americans had stolen their sub, and the diplomatic fallout could trigger a war. The FBI was brought in to hunt down the burglars, but the damage was already done. The story began to leak. Investigative reporters, sensing blood in the water, began to circle. Seymour Hersh of the New York Times and Jack Anderson, a syndicated columnist known for breaking government secrets, started connecting the dots between the strange mining ship, the robbery in L.A., and the whispers coming out of the intelligence community. The CIA fought a desperate rearguard action. CIA Director William Colby personally met with the editors of the major newspapers, pleading with them to kill the story for the sake of national security. He argued that the mission was ongoing, which was a lie, as the lift had failed, and that publishing the story would endanger American lives. Most of the editors agreed to sit on the story, respecting the sensitivity of the operation. But Jack Anderson refused to be silenced. In February 1975, he went on national television and broke the news to the world. He told the American public that the manganese mining story was a lie, that Howard Hughes was a front for the CIA, and that the Glomar Explorer had been built to raise a Soviet nuclear submarine. The headline exploded across the globe. "The Great Submarine Snatch," the paper screamed. The Soviet Union was stunned. The Kremlin had suspected the Americans were up to something. But the sheer scale of the operation, the idea that they had built a ship to lift a submarine from 3 miles down, was beyond their wildest paranoia. They were humiliated. Their Pacific fleet had failed to find the sub, and the Americans had picked it up right under their noses. But interestingly, the Soviet response was muted. To complain publicly would be to admit that they had lost a submarine and hadn't noticed it was gone. It would be an admission of incompetence. So they stayed silent, officially ignoring the report, while privately upgrading their naval codes and purging their intelligence leadership. Back in Washington, the CIA was besieged by journalists demanding confirmation. Was it true? Did they steal the sub? Did they have the missiles? The agency was trapped. If they said yes, it was a diplomatic crisis. If they said no, they were lying to the public and Congress. They needed a new way to speak, a way to say nothing while saying something. In response to a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a journalist about the project, the CIA's press office drafted a response that would become legendary in the annals of government secrecy. They stated that they could neither confirm nor deny the existence of the materials requested. It was the birth of the Glomar response, a phrase that has been used by governments ever since to deflect inquiry without admitting the truth. The heist was over, the secret was out, but the legacy of the mission was just beginning to be understood. The Glomar Explorer had failed to get the codebooks, but it had succeeded in proving that for the United States, there was no place on Earth, not even the bottom of the ocean, that was beyond its reach. When the Hughes Glomar Explorer sailed back into Long Beach in the autumn of 1974, she was no longer an anonymous industrial vessel. She was the most famous ship in the world. The revelation of her true mission by the press had turned her into a celebrity, a physical symbol of American audacity and Cold War intrigue. But for the CIA, she was now a liability. The plan had always been to return to the Pacific the following summer to recover the rest of the submarine, the section containing the ballistic, missiles, and the coveted codebooks. But with the cover story blown, and Soviet warships now permanently guarding the crash site, a second attempt was impossible. Project Azorian was officially dead. The U.S. government was left with a unique problem. They owned a $3-100- and $50- million spaceship designed for an ocean planet, but its only mission was canceled. The Glomar Explorer was a marvel of engineering, equipped with technologies that were decades ahead of their time. But she was also a white elephant, a specialized tool with no job. For a brief period, the government tried to maintain the charade, leasing the ship for actual oceanographic research, but the operating costs were astronomical. By 1976, she was stripped of her sensitive equipment. The Claw was dismantled and sold for scrap, and the great ship was towed to Sassoon Bay near San Francisco. There, she joined the mothball fleet, a collection of rusting World War II relics and obsolete supply ships waiting for the scrapyard. For over 20 years, the Glomar Explorer sat in the mud, her paint fading, her massive derrick casting a long shadow over the bay. To the casual observer driving across the Benicia Bridge, she was just another piece of junk. But inside the engineering community, she was a legend. The irony of the Glomar Explorer is that while her spy mission was a partial failure, her cover story became a technological prophecy. To make the lie of deep-sea mining convincing, the CIA's engineers had been forced to invent technology that didn't exist. They needed a ship that could hold a precise position over a specific spot on the ocean floor without using anchors, which are useless at 3 miles depth. So, they invented dynamic positioning, a system where a computer reads satellite data and automatically fires thrusters to counter the wind and current. They needed to lower miles of heavy pipe without the ship's heaving motion snapping it. So they invented heave compensation, a massive hydraulic system that isolated the pipe string from the movement of the waves. These technologies, developed in total secrecy to steal a submarine, ended up birthing the modern offshore oil and gas industry. When the oil companies began looking for reserves in water deeper than a few hundred feet, they realized the CIA had already solved all their problems. The engineers who cut their teeth on Project Azorian took their knowledge into the private sector. The ability to drill in ultra-deep water, to stabilize platforms in hurricanes, and to work remotely on the seabed, all of this traces its DNA back to the hunt for the K-129. The Glomar Explorer didn't just steal a sub. She accidentally invented the future of ocean engineering. In the late 1990s, the ship finally found a second life that matched her capabilities. She was bought by a commercial drilling company, Global Marine, a descendant of the company that built her, and underwent a massive conversion. The spy gear was gutted, the moon pool was modified, and she was reborn as a deep-water drillship. For another 15 years, the GSF Explorer roamed the oceans, drilling for oil in the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of Africa. She broke world records for drilling depth, proving that the hull built to lift the Soviet tomb was still one of the most capable platforms on the seas. It wasn't until 2015, more than 40 years after her secret launch, that she was finally sent to a scrapyard in China, closing the final chapter on the physical vessel. But the debate over the mission's success continues to this day. Was Project Azorian a triumph or a disaster? Critics argue that it was a colossal waste of taxpayer money. The CIA spent the equivalent of nearly $4 billion in today's currency to recover a 40-foot scrap of steel that contained no missiles and no codebooks. The intelligence gained from the 2 nuclear torpedoes and the submarine's construction was valuable, but hardly a game-changer. The Soviets changed their codes anyway, and the missile technology was already becoming obsolete by the time it was recovered. From a purely objective standpoint, the heist failed to deliver the crown jewels. However, supporters of the mission argue that the value wasn't just in the hardware. It was in the psychological blow it dealt to the Kremlin. The mission proved that the ocean was not a sanctuary. The Soviet Navy had assumed their lost submarines were safe in the deep, that the physics of the abyss protected their secrets. The Glomar Explorer shattered that assumption. It forced the Soviet Union to spend billions of rubles. They didn't have to upgrade their own security, redesign their submarine hulls, and patrol their own backyard. It demonstrated a level of American technological dominance that was terrifying to the Soviet leadership. If the Americans could reach down 3 miles and pick up a 2,000-ton submarine, what else could they do? Could they tap underwater cables? Could they place sensors on the ocean floor? The answer, of course, was yes. The legacy of the Glomar Explorer is complex. It was a failure of intelligence gathering, but a masterpiece of engineering. It was a massive waste of money, but it created an entire industry. And perhaps most importantly, it was the ultimate Cold War gamble, a mission so audacious, so risky, and so technically impossible that even when the Russians saw the ship with their own eyes, they couldn't bring themselves to believe it was real. The ship is gone, recycled into razor blades and rebar, but the Glomar response remains. Whenever a government official stands at a podium and says, "We can neither confirm nor deny," the ghost of the Glomar Explorer is in the room, reminding us that sometimes the truth is too heavy to lift. October 1992, the Kremlin, Moscow. The Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and the red flag over the Kremlin had been replaced by the Russian tricolor. In this new era of tentative friendship, Robert Gates, the director of the CIA, traveled to Moscow on a mission that had nothing to do with espionage and everything to do with closure. He walked into the office of Russian President Boris Yeltsin, not with a threat, but with a videotape. For nearly 20 years, the families of the 98 sailors lost on the K-129 had been living in a cruel limbo. The Soviet government had never officially told them how their sons and husbands had died. They had been listed as missing, a bureaucratic term that denied the families their pensions and, more importantly, their dignity. The official Soviet line was that the submarine had simply vanished, implying incompetence or defection. The families didn't know about the explosion, the 3-mile fall, or the giant American claw that had disturbed their grave. Gates handed the tape to Yeltsin. It was a copy of the film taken on the deck of the Glomar Explorer in September 1974. When the Russian officials played it, they expected to see a triumph of American arrogance, a gloating documentation of a heist. Instead, they saw American sailors in dress uniforms standing at attention. They heard the prayers of a chaplain. They saw the Soviet naval ensign, the flag of their enemy, draped respectfully over the steel coffin. And they heard the familiar swelling notes of the Soviet national anthem playing over the Pacific wind as the bodies were committed to the deep. The effect of the tape was profound. It revealed that the Americans, in the midst of the most expensive spy operation in history, had taken the time to honor the men they had found. It transformed the narrative of Project Azorian from a story of grave robbery into one of complex, if unauthorized, salvage. The video was eventually shown to the families of the crew. For the first time, they saw proof that their loved ones had not defected or failed, but had died at their posts. The bells of the Naval Cathedral in St. Petersburg tolled for them, and the men of the K-129 were finally recognized as heroes who had been lost at sea. Yet, even with the release of the tape, the full story of Project Azorian remains shrouded in the fog of intelligence mythology. To this day, there are those within the intelligence community and naval historians who believe the failure of the claw was a fabrication. A persistent conspiracy theory suggests that the Glomar Explorer actually recovered the entire submarine, missiles, codebooks, and all, and that the story of the claw breaking was a second layer of cover, a lie manufactured to convince the Russians that their codes were still safe, so they wouldn't change them. The CIA has never released the full unredacted files. The official inventory of what was brought up remains classified. We know about the 2 torpedoes, the 6 bodies, and the ship's bell, which was returned to Russia as a diplomatic gesture. But whether the Americans managed to pull a 1-megaton warhead from the abyss, or a cryptographic machine that decrypted decades of Soviet silence, remains a secret locked in the archives at Langley. The Glomar response holds firm. They neither confirm nor deny the full extent of the haul. Today, the wreck site of the K-129 is a quiet, dark place in the middle of the North Pacific. The remaining section of the submarine, containing the nuclear missiles that once threatened the West, sits rusting in the eternal silence of the abyssal plain. It is a radioactive monument to a time when 2 superpowers were willing to go to the ends of the earth, and the cones, bottom of the ocean, to gain an inch of advantage. The plutonium in the warheads will slowly decay over thousands of years, outliving the nations that built them and the men who tried to steal them. Project Azorian stands as the ultimate testament to the madness and the genius of the Cold War. It was an operation where the boundaries between science fiction and reality were erased by an unlimited budget and paranoia. It gave the world the technology to drill for oil in deep water. It gave the government a legal phrase to hide its secrets. And it gave 6 lost sailors a funeral they never would have received from their own country. In the end, the Glomar Explorer proved that there are no secrets safe from a nation with enough money and enough will. The ocean is vast, deep, and terrifying, but it is not deep enough to hide the truth forever. As we look back at the rusted hull of the spy ship and the lost submarine she hunted, we are reminded that history is not just written by the victors. Sometimes it is dredged up from the bottom of the sea, piece by broken piece.